There are battlefields where men see their enemy, where the line between life and death is drawn in dirt, in blood, in the flash of muzzle fire under an open sky. And then there are battlefields where the enemy is invisible, where sound becomes survival and silence becomes death, where warriors descend into absolute darkness, sealed inside metal tombs, breathing recycled air, fighting a war measured not in yards gained or hills taken, but in heartbeats and whispers. This is the story of the submarine hunters of World War II, men who fought in a theater so terrifying, so psychologically brutal that even today, decades after the last depth charge fell silent, we struggle to comprehend what they endured. Because in the Atlantic Ocean, in the endless dark beneath the waves, the hunter became the hunted. And the ocean was always watching. The ocean doesn't choose sides. It doesn't care about flags or causes, about democracy or tyranny. It simply exists, vast, patient, indifferent to human suffering. 3 miles deep in some places, holding secrets that will never surface, carrying the bodies of men who went down fighting invisible enemies in the cold dark. The ocean takes everyone eventually. It took the U-boat crews, trapped in their iron coffins as water rushed through ruptured hulls. It took the destroyer escort sailors, blown apart when torpedoes found their mark. And for those who survived, for those who made it home to dry land and warm beds, the ocean took something else. It took their peace, their sleep, their ability to exist in silence without hearing the phantom echoes of sonar pings, searching for death in the darkness. This was submarine warfare. This was the silent theater, where men fought enemies they could not see, in a realm where one mistake didn't just kill you, it drowned your entire crew. The terror of this warfare defied everything soldiers had been trained to expect. Infantry could see the muzzle flash, could watch the enemy advance, could dig in and hold ground. Pilots flew in 3 dimensions, but could see the sky, the earth, the tracers coming up from below. Even tankers, sealed inside steel, could observe the battlefield through their viewports. But submarine hunters, they fought shadows. They listened to electronic whispers bouncing off thermal layers and schools of fish, trying to distinguish the mechanical heartbeat of a U-boat from the 1,000 false signatures the ocean generated to protect its secrets. Every sonar ping could be death approaching at 40 knots. Every moment of silence could mean a torpedo was already in the water, racing toward them through the cold Atlantic darkness. And they would never know until the warhead detonated against their hull and the ocean came pouring in. This was psychological warfare at its purest. Men fighting not just an external enemy, but the fear that ate them from within. The terror that lived in every creak of the hull, every pressure change, every sound that didn't belong. Stephen E. Ambrose wrote with profound understanding about paratroopers dropping into darkness over Normandy, not knowing what awaited them below, whether they would land in an open field or a German machine gun nest, whether their chute would open or tangle, whether they would see dawn or die before their boots touched French soil. The submarine hunters knew that same terrible uncertainty, but theirs was stretched across hours, days, weeks at sea. Just as those paratroopers descended into darkness, with nothing but their training and their brothers beside them, the destroyer escort crews descended into an abyss where the enemy could be anywhere or nowhere. They hunted in a realm where human senses became useless, where technology was primitive and unreliable, where every decision was made with incomplete information and absolute stakes. Drop the depth charges too soon, and you waste precious ordnance on a phantom. Drop them too late, and the U-boat escapes to kill again. Miss entirely, and you've just announced your position to a predator that now knows exactly where you are. Karl Marlantes understood a truth that every combat veteran carries but few can articulate. In his masterwork Matterhorn, he wrote that in war, the real enemy is not the one shooting at you. It's the fear that eats you from within. For the submarine hunters, that fear lived in every sonar ping that echoed back from the depths, in every creak and groan of the hull as the ship rolled through heavy seas, In the silence between contacts, when they knew that somewhere beneath them, a U-boat commander was making calculations, setting firing solutions, preparing to send 46 pounds of high explosive into their ship at a closing speed that left no time for evasion. The fear wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the sudden terror of an ambush or the adrenaline spike of close combat. It was steady, relentless, grinding. The knowledge that at any moment, without warning, the ocean could come rushing in, and that would be the end. No time to fight back, no chance to surrender. Just the cold Atlantic darkness and the terrible pressure of depth, crushing everything human out of existence. These weren't just sailors. They were brothers, sealed in steel, breathing air that tasted of diesel fuel and sweat and fear, fighting a war that most Americans never understood and fewer still could imagine. They were 19-year-old farm boys from Kansas who had never seen the ocean before enlisting, now listening through headphones for the mechanical signature of death moving through the water. They were captains, barely into their 30s, responsible for 150 lives, making decisions based on imperfect information and the terrible mathematics of probability. They were depth charge crews who loaded ordnance with frozen hands, knowing that every canister they rolled off the stern was either saving the convoy ahead or killing men who were just like them. Young, scared, far from home, fighting for a cause they believed in. They volunteered for this duty. They could have chosen safer postings, could have served on cruisers or battleships, or stayed stateside training new recruits. But they came to the Atlantic because the convoys needed protecting, because merchant ships carrying food and fuel and ammunition were being slaughtered by wolf packs, because someone had to hunt the hunters. And so they went into the darkness together, bound by a covenant older than warfare itself, that they would stand by each other, that no man would face the terror alone, that if death came, it would find them at their posts, doing their duty, faithful to the end. The Atlantic Ocean, 1943. The wolf packs are winning. German U-boats move in coordinated groups, hunting Allied convoys like predators, tracking wounded prey across an endless plain. In the first 3 months of the year, they sink over 100 merchant ships, oil tankers exploding into pillars of flame visible for 30 miles. Cargo vessels going down so fast, their crews have no time to launch lifeboats. Troopships carrying young soldiers who never make it to the war because they drown in the mid-Atlantic darkness, weighed down by their boots and equipment and the terrible realization that they will die without ever seeing combat. The statistics are brutal, impersonal, the kind of numbers that appear in War Department briefings as columns of figures. But every number is a name. Every statistic is a man who had a mother, a hometown, a girl waiting for him, dreams that ended in cold water and the knowledge that help would not arrive in time. This is the crisis point of the Battle of the Atlantic, the moment when the outcome of the entire war hangs on a simple question. Can the convoys get through? A destroyer escort, let's call her the USS Samuel B. Roberts, though she could be any of the hundreds of small warships that fought this lonely battle, receives a single sonar contact. The operator, a kid with steady hands and good ears despite being just 19 years old, calls it out with the flat tone of someone trying to control the fear rising in his throat. Contact bearing 270, range 1,800 yards, moving left to right. The captain, standing over the plotting table in the cramped Combat Information Center, knows the mathematics of death. If this is a U-boat, the German commander already heard their screws, already knows a warship is hunting him, and is right now making his own calculations. Submerge deeper and try to slip away, or turn toward the threat and fire first. If this contact is just a whale or a temperature anomaly, or one of the 1,000 false signatures the ocean generates to confuse sonar operators, then they're about to waste depth charges they cannot afford to lose. Ordnance that costs money and time and strategic positioning. The captain has perhaps 30 seconds to decide. 30 seconds to weigh incomplete information against absolute stakes. 30 seconds to choose between caution and aggression, between the safety of his ship and the safety of the convoy 8 miles ahead that is counting on him to keep the sea lanes clear. But here's the reality that no training manual mentions. The truth that destroyer escort captains learned through bitter experience and the loss of too many good ships. Sonar lies. The ocean is not a simple medium where sound waves travel in straight lines and bounce back with perfect fidelity. It's a complex, layered environment where temperature gradients bend acoustic energy, where thermoclines create dead zones, where submarines can hide in plain sight, where schools of fish generate signatures that look exactly like enemy contacts on a sonar scope. The Germans know this. Their U-boat commanders are taught to exploit these natural phenomena, to dive beneath the thermocline layer, where the temperature differential creates an acoustic mirror that reflects sonar waves back toward the surface, making the submarine essentially invisible to the hunters above. They hide in thermal layers like prey animals using terrain, waiting with engines stopped and every man aboard breathing as quietly as possible, knowing that the destroyer escort above them is listening for the slightest sound, the smallest indication that they're still there. It becomes a contest of patience and nerve, who can wait longer, who can maintain silence more completely, who can endure the psychological pressure of knowing that one mistake means death. The crew waits. They stand at their stations, watching their instruments, listening to the sound of their own breathing inside the confined spaces of the ship. The sonarman's hands tremble slightly as he adjusts his equipment, fine-tuning the gain, trying to filter out the background noise of the ocean and isolate that one signature that will tell him whether they're hunting a submarine or chasing ghosts. He's 19 years old, from a small town in Kansas, where the only water was the creek behind his family's farm. He'd never seen the ocean before enlisting, had never imagined he would end up here, sealed inside a steel ship in the middle of the Atlantic, wearing headphones that make his ears ache, listening for the mechanical heartbeat of a submarine somewhere in 1,000 square miles of water. His training was 8 weeks of classroom instruction and practical exercises in calm harbors. Nothing that could prepare him for this, for the reality of hunting an enemy that exists only as electronic whispers, for the knowledge that if he makes a mistake, if he misidentifies the contact or loses tracking, men will die. Maybe men on his ship, maybe men on the merchant vessels in the convoy. But men will die, and it will be because he failed. The psychological torture of this kind of warfare is unlike anything experienced by other combat arms. Infantry soldiers face terrible things: the shock of ambush, the chaos of close combat, the sight of friends killed beside them. But they can see their enemy. They can shoot back. They can take cover, advance, retreat, make tactical decisions based on observable conditions. Pilots fly in 3 dimensions of freedom, able to maneuver and evade, to use speed and altitude as weapons. Even submariners, trapped in their own metal coffins, have the advantage of stealth and surprise, the ability to strike first and slip away. But destroyer escort crews fight shadows. They fight uncertainty. Every sonar ping could be death approaching at 40 knots, a torpedo with their name on it, running silent and true through the dark water. Every moment of silence could mean the U-boat has already fired, and the weapon is in the water. And in 60 seconds or less, the warhead will detonate against their hull, and the ocean will come pouring in through a hole the size of a Buick. And there will be no time to launch lifeboats, no time to send a final message, no time for anything except the terrible realization that the ocean is claiming them, and there's nothing they can do to stop it. The captain makes the call, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. Comments attack run. All hands brace for depth charges. The destroyer escort surges forward, accelerating to flank speed, the deck plates vibrating under the crew's feet as the engines push the ship faster, faster toward the last known position of the contact. The depth charge crews work with practiced efficiency, rolling the heavy canisters to the stern racks, setting the detonation depth based on the captain's calculations. If the U-boat is at 200 feet, They set for 200 feet, trusting mathematics and probability because that's all they have. The charges drop in a calculated pattern, a geometry of violence based on sound waves and educated guesses and the bitter experience of men who have done this before and know that success is never guaranteed. The ocean erupts. Geysers of white water shoot 50 feet into the air as the charges detonate. Each explosion containing 600 pounds of torpex that sends a shock wave through the water, a pressure wave powerful enough to rupture hulls and kill men through sheer hydraulic force, even if the explosion isn't close enough to tear metal. The ship shakes from the violence of its own weapons. Men grab stanchions and bulkheads to keep their footing as the deck heaves beneath them. Then silence. The kind of silence that's worse than noise, worse than the chaos of combat, because it's the silence of uncertainty. Did they kill it? Did the depth charges find their target, crack the pressure hull, send the U-boat spiraling toward the bottom with water rushing in and men screaming in the darkness? Or did they miss? Did the submarine slip away during the attack run, diving deeper or turning sharply, evading the pattern, and is now somewhere beneath them, wounded perhaps but still dangerous? Still capable of launching torpedoes? Or worse, did they just announce their position to a predator that's been stalking them all along, and the contact they thought they were hunting was actually bait? And now the real threat is lining up a shot from a different bearing entirely. The crew doesn't speak. They listen. The sonarman presses his headphones tighter against his ears, scanning through frequencies, searching for any sound that will tell them the outcome. The captain stands motionless at the plotting table, waiting for information, knowing that the next few minutes will determine whether they've won this engagement or whether they've just made themselves a target. In that moment, suspended between action and outcome, every man aboard is alone with his fear. The sonar man alone with the terrible responsibility of his ears, knowing that if he misses a sound or misinterprets a signature, the consequences will be measured in lives. The captain alone with his command, second-guessing every decision, wondering if he attacked too soon or waited too long, if he set the depth charges correctly or wasted them on a phantom. The depth charge crews alone with their hands, which loaded the weapons and sent them into the water, and which now tremble slightly with the aftershock of adrenaline and the knowledge that what they've done cannot be undone. And yet, despite this aloneness, despite each man being trapped inside his own skull with his own fears and doubts, they are completely dependent on each other. The sonarman needs the captain's experience to interpret what he's hearing. The captain needs the sonarman's ears to make tactical decisions. The depth charge crews need both of them to tell them when to load and when to drop and when to pray. If any one man fails, if the sonarman loses contact, if the captain misjudges the attack geometry, if the depth charge crews mishandle the ordnance, they all die. Not might die, will die. Because in submarine warfare, there are no individual mistakes. There is only collective success or collective death. And right now, in this moment of terrible silence after the depth charges have detonated and before they know the outcome, they exist in a state of quantum uncertainty where they are simultaneously victors and victims, hunters and prey, alive and already dead, waiting for the universe to collapse into one reality or the other. What the movies don't show, what the recruitment posters never mentioned, what no amount of training could prepare these men for, is the smell. Diesel fuel soaked into everything. The deck plates, the bulkheads, the uniforms that never quite dried in the damp Atlantic air. The smell of unwashed bodies, because fresh water was rationed and a man counted himself lucky to get a sponge bath once a week. The chemical stench of the heads, the toilets that barely worked in heavy seas and sometimes backed up, sending human waste sloshing across the deck. The smell of cooking grease and burned coffee, and the unique odor of fear, which is sweat and adrenaline and something else, something primal that emerges when men know they might die at any moment. For weeks at sea, destroyer escorts became floating prisons of odor and exhaustion. Spaces so confined that a man could touch both sides of a passageway with his outstretched arms. Where 150 souls lived stacked in bunks 3 high with 18 inches between each level. Where the air tasted stale and metallic and was never quite enough. Men slept in 4-hour shifts, if they slept at all, because the sea didn't rest and neither did the enemy. Hot meals were a luxury dependent on sea conditions and combat status. Fresh water was rationed to the point where drinking took priority over hygiene, and men learned to live with the grime and salt that caked their skin. And through it all, every single man aboard knew one immutable truth. One torpedo ends everything. The unspoken bargain that every destroyer escort sailor made was this: they volunteered for this duty. They raised their hands and took the oath, knowing what submarine warfare meant, knowing the statistics, knowing that the Atlantic was a graveyard and they were sailing into it. They could have chosen safer postings. The Navy had plenty of positions stateside, training commands and logistics units and desk jobs that would have kept them far from the wolf packs and the killing grounds. They could have requested assignment to cruisers or battleships, larger vessels with better living conditions and more armor between them and the ocean. But they came to the destroyer escorts because convoys needed protecting. Because merchant ships, ugly, slow, defenseless cargo vessels crewed by civilians, were carrying the food and fuel and ammunition that would win the war. Because Liberty ships were being sunk faster than they could be built, and every ship that went down took 40 or 50 men with it. Merchant sailors who signed up to haul cargo and instead found themselves in the water, watching their ships sink, knowing that in the North Atlantic in winter, the water temperature was 40 degrees, and hypothermia would kill them in 20 minutes whether they could swim or not. Someone had to hunt the hunters. Someone had to stand between the convoys and the wolf packs. Someone had to accept the mission that offered little glory and considerable risk, that promised exhaustion and terror and the possibility of dying in the cold Atlantic darkness, far from home. The veteran sonar man, Chief Petty Officer James Daniels, 32 years old, already ancient by destroyer escort standards, teaches the rookies the sounds of death with the flat, matter-of-fact delivery of a man who has heard these sounds too many times. He sits the new kid down in the sonar compartment during a rare, quiet moment and puts the headphones on him and says, "Listen, really listen, because your life and everyone else's depends on knowing these sounds by heart." That high-pitched whine, mechanical and rising in frequency like a tea kettle building toward a scream. That's a torpedo running hot, straight and normal. You hear that sound and you've got maybe 60 seconds, maybe less. Time enough to sound general quarters if you're fast. Time enough to try evasive maneuvers if the captain's good and the ship's lucky. But probably not time enough for both. That groaning sound, metal under stress, deep and prolonged like the earth itself is protesting. That's a submarine going deep, hull compressing under pressure as the U-boat tries to get below the thermocline or reach crush depth for the destroyer's depth charges. Means the commander's scared. Means he's running. Means if you can stay on him, keep tracking, you might have a chance to make the kill before he slips away into one of the ocean's hiding places. But the worst sound, Chief Daniels tells the rookie, the sound that keeps you awake even when you're off watch and exhausted beyond measure, is silence. Dead silence. Complete absence of mechanical noise. No engine vibration. No cavitation from propellers. Nothing but the ambient sound of the ocean itself. That silence means the U-boat commander has shut down everything, stopped his engines, stopped all non-essential systems, ordered his crew to absolute quiet, even had them remove their boots so footsteps wouldn't transmit through the hull. That silence means he's sitting on the bottom if the water's shallow enough, or hovering at neutral buoyancy if it's deep, waiting for the destroyer escort to give up and leave, waiting with the patience of a predator that knows time is on his side, because he can stay down for hours while the convoy is moving farther away every minute. And here's the terrible part, Chief Daniel says, meeting the rookie's eyes so he understands the weight of this. We can't leave. We cannot leave. Because the convoy is 8 miles ahead, and if we break off contact and steam away, that U-boat commander surfaces and kills them all. Every merchant ship, every civilian sailor, every ton of supplies, all gone because we couldn't wait him out, couldn't match his patience with our own. So we sit here circling over the last known position, listening to silence, knowing he's down there somewhere, and we wait. We wait because that's the mission. We wait because other men are counting on us. We wait because if we don't, people die. The moral weight of this duty pressed down on these men in ways that civilians could never fully comprehend. They weren't fighting for glory. There were no parades for anti-submarine warfare, no photographers capturing dramatic moments for the newspapers back home, no medal ceremonies that made the headlines. They fought in anonymity, in the vast, empty spaces of the Atlantic, where no one witnessed their battles except the ocean itself. Success in their war meant nothing happened. Success meant the convoy arrived safely at Liverpool or Murmansk, or wherever it was bound, and the merchant sailors unloaded their cargo and went to the pub and complained about the food and the weather. And no one ever knew that a destroyer escort crew had spent 3 days hunting a U-boat through a storm, had dropped every depth charge they had driven the submarine so deep and so far that it couldn't reach attack position before the convoy passed beyond range. Success was invisible. Success was the absence of disaster. Success meant doing your job so well that it looked like there was no job to do. No one writes home about nothing happening. No one tells stories about the torpedo that never arrived, the merchant ship that didn't sink, the lives that continued simply because a sonar operator heard a sound, and a captain made the right decision, and a depth charge crew did their job with frozen hands in a winter storm. But failure means headlines. Failure means the radio broadcast that begins with the announcers. Somber voice saying that today the War Department released the names of merchant sailors lost when the SS Robert E. Peary was torpedoed 300 miles east of Iceland. Failure means 47 men dead, most of them drowning in the cold water, a few of them killed instantly when the torpedo detonated in the engine room and sent superheated steam through the ship. Failure means the knowledge that you were supposed to be protecting that convoy, that somewhere in your patrol sector a U-boat got into position, made the kill, and you either didn't detect it or couldn't stop it, or were hunting a different contact while the real threat slipped past. That's the burden these men carried. That's the weight that sat on their shoulders every moment they were at sea, and followed them into their bunks when they tried to sleep and haunted their dreams when sleep finally came. Invisible success, public failure, the knowledge that the world would never thank them for doing their job well, but would absolutely blame them if they failed. And still they stayed. Still they took the watch. Still they stood at their stations and listened to the sonar pings and waited for the sound of death moving through the water, because someone had to do it, and they had volunteered to be that someone. And honor meant keeping faith with that choice, even when the choice became harder than they ever imagined it could be. Contact, solid, moving. The sonar operator's voice cuts through the ambient noise of the Combat Information Center with the kind of clarity that comes from absolute certainty. This is not a ghost signature. This is not a school of fish or a temperature anomaly or wishful thinking transformed into false hope. This is a submarine, mechanical and real, moving through the water at a depth calculated to avoid detection, but not deep enough to escape tracking. The hunt begins in earnest now. The destroyer escort and the U-boat commence a lethal dance. A chess match played with hydrophones and periscopes where every move could be the last, where the penalty for a mistake is not losing pieces on a board, but losing lives in the cold Atlantic darkness. The American captain stands at the plotting table, watching his crew mark the submarine's position with grease pencil on the transparent overlay, calculating intercept courses and attack patterns. Below the surface, the German commander stands in his control room, listening to the sound of the destroyer's screws transmitted through the water. watching his own crew's faces for any sign of panic, knowing that leadership in this moment means projecting calm even when your heart is hammering against your ribs and your mind is running through all the ways this could end badly. In the submarine, Korvettenkapitan Heinrich Lehmann knows his boat is wounded. The near-miss depth charge from 2 hours ago cracked a seal in the aft torpedo room. Nothing catastrophic, not yet, but they're leaking oil. A thin, steady stream that rises to the surface and spreads out in an iridescent slick visible for miles in good light. His chief engineer reported it with the kind of professional detachment that German submariners cultivated as a defense against fear. But Lehmann heard what wasn't said. They're leaving a trail, a breadcrumb path straight to their position. The destroyer escort captain doesn't need sonar anymore. He just needs to follow the oil. Lehmann's crew looks at him with the question they won't ask out loud, because asking makes it real, and making it real means confronting what they all already know. Are we already dead? Is this the moment where luck runs out and skill isn't enough, and the mathematics of war finally catch up to us? He's 28 years old. Before the war, he was studying architecture at the University of Hamburg, drawing buildings that would stand for centuries, dreaming of creating beauty in a world that seemed determined to destroy it. Now he's responsible for 42 men sealed in a steel tube at the bottom of the Atlantic, and the only thing he's building is a desperate plan to keep them alive through the next hour. On the destroyer, the captain sees the oil slick spreading across the water like a wound bleeding out under the surface. His executive officer, a lieutenant commander who's been with him since the ship's commissioning, says what everyone on the bridge is thinking with the kind of grim satisfaction that comes from finally having a clear target after hours of hunting shadows. We've got him, sir. The submarine's leaving a trail we can follow all the way to hell if we need to. We can end this right now. But the captain knows better than to celebrate before the kill is confirmed. He's been in this war long enough to understand that wounded animals are the most dangerous, that a U-boat commander with nothing to lose might take risks that a healthy boat wouldn't consider, might turn toward the threat instead of away from it, might decide that if he's going down, he's taking an American warship with him. The captain orders a holding pattern, circling the oil slick at a distance that keeps them in contact but out of immediate torpedo range, waiting and watching and forcing the submarine commander to make a choice. Surface and fight, accepting that his deck gun is no match for the destroyer's 5-inch main battery, but at least dying in the open air with the sky above instead of drowning in the dark. Stay down until the oxygen runs out, gambling that the destroyer will be called away to another contact or another emergency before the crew suffocates. Or try to run, diving deeper despite the oil leak, hoping to reach a thermocline or a current that might break contact long enough to slip away. The impossible empathy of this moment is something neither commander would ever acknowledge, but both feel in the depths of their tactical thinking. They understand each other perfectly across the distance and the language barrier and the opposing causes that brought them to this point. They've never met. They speak different languages. They fight for nations that are trying to destroy each other, for ideologies that are fundamentally incompatible, for futures that cannot coexist. But they share the same reality with an intimacy that transcends politics and nationalism and all the grand reasons men give for going to war. They're both trying to bring their men home alive. That's the truth beneath all the strategy and tactics and operational objectives. That's the human core of this lethal game they're playing. Lehmann looks at his crew. Boys, really. Most of them not old enough to vote or drink or marry without their parents' consent. Now old enough to die in a metal tube under crushing pressure, and knows that every decision he makes carries their lives in the balance. The American captain looks at his own crew and carries the same weight, the same responsibility, the same burden of command that makes sleep impossible and doubt constant and second-guessing. A permanent condition of leadership, the executive officer asks the question that's been hanging in the air since they spotted the oil slick. The question that reveals the moral complexity hiding beneath the surface of this wall. Sir, why don't we just finish it? We've got him dead to rights. One more depth charge pattern, and he's done. We can move on, rejoin the convoy, get back to the mission. Why are we waiting? The captain's response comes slowly, carefully, with the weight of a man who's thought about these things during the long night watches when the ship is quiet and there's nothing to do but stand on the bridge and stare at the dark water and wonder about the men trying to kill you and whether they're really so different from the men standing beside you. Because 40 German sailors drowning doesn't win us the war, he says, his voice low enough that only the XO can hear. But it might cost us our humanity. It might cost us the thing that makes us different from them, the thing that justifies all of this killing and dying and suffering. We're not executing prisoners. We're not murdering defeated enemies. We're warriors, and warriors give quarter when they can. He picks up the signal lamp, aims it at the oil slick, at the position where the submarine is hiding beneath the surface, and sends a message in international code. Surface and surrender. You have 5 minutes. No harm will come to you or your crew. You have my word as an officer. The submarine's response is a torpedo launch. The sound reaches the destroyer through the water before the sonar operator can call it out. A high-pitched mechanical scream that every man aboard recognizes instantly. The choice is made. Mercy ends. The German commander has decided that surrender is not an option, that dying fighting is preferable to living as a prisoner, or perhaps that he doesn't trust the American captain's word. Or perhaps that his orders are explicit and absolute and leave no room for personal judgment about when to give up and when to keep fighting. Whatever his reasons, whatever combination of duty and honor and fear and pride drove the decision, the result is the same. A torpedo is in the water. The captain's offer of mercy is answered with an attempt at murder. And now the rules change completely. The captain gives the order with the flat, emotionless tone of a man doing something necessary but not desired. All batteries, commence firing. Depth charges, full pattern. Hedgehogs, maximum spread. He's trying to kill us. We end this now. The destroyer attacks with everything it has. 5-inch shells arc through the air and plunge into the ocean above the submarine's position, detonating at preset depths, sending shockwaves through the water that rattle the U-boat's hull and crack gauges and knock men off their feet. Depth charges roll off the stern and drop through the water column, exploding in sequence, creating a hammer and anvil effect that crushes anything caught between the pressure waves. Hedgehogs launch from the forward deck, 24 projectiles arcing through the air and splashing into the water in a circular pattern, contact-fused warheads that only detonate if they hit something solid. And when 3 of them find the submarine's hull, the explosions merge into a single catastrophic event that tears metal and flesh and hope apart with equal efficiency. The ocean becomes a cauldron of violence, the surface boiling white with the energy of multiple detonations, the water itself turned into a weapon that crushes and burns and drowns. For 90 seconds, the destroyer pours destruction into the sea, expending ordnance that took months to manufacture and transport across an ocean, spending American treasure and industrial might with the singular goal of killing 42 men sealed inside a steel tube. When it's over, when the last depth charge has detonated and the guns fall silent and the ocean begins to settle back into its normal rhythms, wreckage surfaces. Oil, thick and black, spreading across the water in quantities that could only come from ruptured fuel tanks. Debris, pieces of decking, a life jacket, personal items that tell the story of lives interrupted. A boot, a photograph in a waterproof case, a cap with the German naval insignia. But no survivors, no men swimming in the wreckage, no hands raised in surrender or voices calling for help. Just the terrible silence of the ocean claiming its own, pulling the broken submarine down into the depths where the pressure is so great that human bodies compress and metal crumbles and everything that was once solid becomes part of the eternal darkness. The captain writes in his log with handwriting that's steady, despite the tremor he feels inside. U-boat destroyed. All hands lost. Position marked for intelligence purposes. Resuming patrol. The words are formal, official, the kind of language that turns human tragedy into bureaucratic record. 42 men just died. 42 sons and brothers and husbands and fathers are gone, and their families don't know it yet. And when they learn about it weeks or months from now through official notifications, the details will be sparse and sanitized and will convey nothing of what actually happened here. Nothing of the fear and the violence and the finality of death in the deep ocean. The captain goes to his cabin and closes the door and sits on his bunk in the small private space that command affords. Him doesn't speak for 6 hours. He doesn't cry. He doesn't pray. He doesn't second-guess his decisions or wonder if he could have done something differently. He simply sits in silence with the weight of what he's done, with the knowledge that he tried to show mercy and was answered with violence and so responded with greater violence, with the terrible understanding that war reduces everything to its simplest terms, and in those terms there is no room for doubt or regret or the luxury of feeling bad about necessary actions. 42 men are dead. His crew is alive. The convoy is safe. The mission continues. These are the facts, and facts don't care about feelings. But he's still human enough to need these 6 hours of silence, still connected enough to his own humanity to require this small, private mourning for men he killed without ever seeing their faces, without ever knowing their names, without ever understanding what dreams they carried, or what futures they hoped for, or what they might have become if the world had been different and war had not consumed them all. 3 months later, stateside, Chief Petty Officer James Daniels stands in a grocery store in Portsmouth, Virginia, trying to remember what his wife asked him to buy. The list is in his pocket, but he can't focus on it because the fluorescent lights are too bright and there are too many people and the sounds are overwhelming after months at sea where the only noises were mechanical and purposeful and never random, like this chaos of shopping, carts and conversations, and children laughing in ways that sound almost like screaming. He's in the canned goods aisle when it happens. A child, maybe 4 years old, reaches for something on a high shelf and knocks over a can of soup. The can falls, tumbling end over end, and hits the tile floor with a metallic clang that echoes through the store. The sound reaches Daniel's ears, and his brain doesn't process it as a soup can hitting linoleum. His brain, rewired by months of listening for death in the darkness, interprets it as a depth charge detonating close aboard, and his body responds before his conscious mind can intervene. He drops to his knees, hands over his ears, heart hammering against his ribs so hard he thinks he might be having a cardiac event. The world narrows to a pinpoint. He can't breathe right, can't think, can't separate the grocery store from the combat information center, can't distinguish between Virginia and the Atlantic, can't convince his nervous system that he's safe and the war is over and no one is trying to kill him anymore. His wife finds him in the frozen food aisle 5 minutes later, still on his knees, shaking like a man with fever chills. She doesn't ask what happened because she's learned over the past 3 weeks since he came home that asking makes it worse, that talking about it brings the war back into their living room in ways that damage them both. She just helps him to his feet, pays for the groceries they came for, drives him home in silence while he stares out the window at a country that looks nothing like the place he left, and everything like a world he no longer understands or fits into. That night he sleeps in the guest room because he wakes up fighting phantom enemies and his wife has bruises on her. Arms from the last time he had a nightmare and she tried to wake. Him and his combat reflexes engaged before his conscious mind recognized her face. He doesn't talk about this with anyone. Not with her. Not with his friends. Not with the other veterans he sees sometimes at the VFW hall who have their own invisible wounds and their own reasons for drinking more than they should and staring at nothing for long periods of time. The truth about submarine warfare trauma is that it defies explanation in ways that even other combat Veterans struggle to comprehend. Infantry soldiers come home with stories about firefights and ambushes, about seeing their friends killed beside them, about the chaos and terror of close combat. Those stories are terrible, but they're also comprehensible. People can imagine what it means to be shot at, to shoot back, to watch someone die. But how do you explain being hunted by something you never saw? How do you describe the terror of listening for death in the darkness? Of knowing that at any moment a torpedo could be in the water and you'd have 60 seconds to live, and there would be nothing you could do about it? How do you make someone understand what it's like to drop depth charges on a submarine, knowing that you're trying to kill men who are exactly like you, who have mothers and girlfriends and dreams, men whose only crime is wearing a different uniform and following different orders? The civilian world has no framework for understanding this kind of warfare, no language adequate to describe the psychological weight of fighting invisible enemies in an environment designed to kill humans, no way to comprehend what it does to a man's mind, to spend months sealed in steel, listening to electronic whispers that might be death approaching. In 1945, the Navy didn't have words like post-traumatic stress disorder or complex trauma, or any of the clinical terminology that would emerge decades later as doctors tried to understand what war does to the human mind. They called it war fatigue when they called it anything at all. They called it nervous exhaustion. They suggested that men who struggled to readjust just needed time and rest and the support of their families, as if trauma was something you could sleep off like a hangover. As if the rewiring of the nervous system could be undone through willpower and positive thinking. Daniels called it the pings because that's what he heard in the silence. Years after the war ended, years after he stopped going to sea, he still heard phantom sonar echoes in his head. In quiet rooms late at night when his wife was sleeping and the house was still. In restaurants when the background noise dropped away for a moment. In church during the silent prayer when everyone bowed their heads and he was supposed to be talking to God, but instead was listening for the mechanical heartbeat of a submarine that wasn't there and never would be again. The sound of searching for something that wanted to kill you. The sound of hunting and being hunted simultaneously. The sound that meant someone was about to die and you didn't know if it would be you or them until the moment arrived. And the uncertainty ended one way or another. The Brotherhood of silence that connected destroyer. Escort veterans was both a source of comfort and a form of imprisonment. They didn't talk about their service, not even to each other. The war had been too intimate, too dark, too saturated with moral complexity and physical terror for easy conversation. They'd gather at reunions sometimes, men who served on the same ships or fought in the same campaigns. And they'd drink together and laugh at old jokes and reminisce about ports of call and shore leave adventures. But they never talked about the actual fighting, never discussed the depth charge attacks or the torpedo, evasions, or the nights when merchant ships in their convoy were hit and went down and they couldn't stop to pick up survivors because stopping meant making themselves targets and abandoning the mission. They never talked about what it felt like to kill men they couldn't see, to listen through headphones as a submarine broke apart under pressure and 40 voices screamed for help that would never come. They'd seen friends die in seconds, ships torpedoed and sinking before anyone could respond, explosions that turned steel vessels into funeral pyres. They'd dropped depth charges knowing that each one was either saving lives or taking them, and sometimes both simultaneously. They carried memories too heavy to share, experiences too dark to speak about, guilt too complex to explain. One veteran, interviewed by a graduate student researching naval history in 1982, tried to put words to the thing that haunted him 37 years after the war ended. The student asked him what it felt like to be thanked for his service, to be honored as a hero, to receive gratitude from strangers who hadn't been born when he was fighting in the Atlantic. The veteran, whose name appears in the dissertation only as Subject 7, sat silent for a long time before answering. "People thanked us for our service," he finally said, his voice flat and distant, as if he was reading from a script someone else had written. "But how do you accept gratitude for becoming a killer? I joined the Navy to protect people. I wanted to save lives. I believed in the cause, believed we were fighting for something worth the cost. And maybe we were. But I ended up hunting men like game, tracking them, trapping them, killing them. And the thing is, they were doing the same to us. They were hunting us. If they'd won, if they'd been the ones dropping charges on our ship, nobody would have called them murderers. They would have been heroes in their own country. So what does that make me? What does it mean when the only difference between a hero and a murderer is which side won? The cost of duty cannot be measured in statistics or casualties or ships sunk and submarines destroyed. The real cost shows up decades later in grocery stores and quiet rooms and sleepless nights. These sailors did what their nation asked of them. They hunted submarines through winter storms with primitive technology and frozen hands and determination born from the knowledge that failure meant other men would die. They saved thousands of lives by taking hundreds, by accepting the moral burden of violence in service of a cause they believed was just. They came home to parades that never happened, to recognition that never arrived, to a civilian world that had no idea what they'd done or what it had cost them. And they came home to silence, the silence of gratitude unspoken because submarine warfare happened far from cameras and journalists and the public eye. The silence of trauma unexpressed because they had no words for what they'd experienced and no one to talk to who would understand. The silence they imposed on themselves because some memories are too dark to share, some experiences too terrible to speak about, some knowledge too bitter to pass on to others. They carried this silence for the rest of their lives. These men who hunted in darkness so others could sail in light. These warriors who fought invisible enemies and came home with invisible wounds and lived with the weight of what they'd done in service of what they believed was right. Today, sonar operators in the United States Navy still train on the same fundamental principles that those 1943 sailors pioneered through trial and error and the bitter experience of men who learned their lessons in combat or didn't live long enough to apply them. Listen, analyze, decide. The technology has evolved beyond anything those World War II crews could have imagined. Digital processing that can distinguish a submarine from a whale with near-perfect accuracy. Passive arrays that can detect contacts hundreds of miles away. Computers that track multiple targets simultaneously and calculate intercept solutions in milliseconds. But the human element remains unchanged. A sonarman still sits in a darkened compartment wearing headphones, still listens to electronic representations of acoustic energy propagating through water, still makes judgments that carry life and death consequences. The equipment is better. The training is more sophisticated. The theoretical understanding of underwater acoustics is orders of magnitude more advanced. But modern technology cannot replicate what those World War II destroyer escort crews faced. Every single day they were at sea, the absolute uncertainty of primitive sonar that lied as often as it told the truth. The technological limitations that meant hunting submarines was more art than science. The knowledge that every decision was made with incomplete information and total stakes. They hunted with equipment that would be museum pieces now, with doctrine that was still being written, with tactics that evolved through desperate innovation and the accumulated wisdom of survivors who learned what worked and what didn't through methods that cost lives to discover. The lesson preserved in their experience transcends the specific details of anti-submarine warfare and speaks to something universal about courage and duty and the nature of service in impossible circumstances. In Mayport, Florida, at the naval station where destroyer escorts once departed for convoy duty in the Atlantic, there's a small memorial to the crews who served on those ships. It's not a grand monument. There's no eternal flame burning in tribute to the fallen, no towering statuary depicting heroic poses, no marble columns inscribed with soaring rhetoric about sacrifice and honor. Just a simple granite plaque set into A low stone wall near the waterfront, weathered by salt air and largely ignored by the thousands of sailors who walk past it every year without pausing to read the names carved into the stone or consider what those names represent. The plaque lists destroyer escorts lost during the war, ships sunk by torpedoes or bombs or kamikaze attacks, vessels that went down with most or all of their crews, taking young men to the bottom of oceans around the world. Below the names is a single line of text, 7 words that capture the essence of what these sailors did and why they did it. We hunted in darkness so others could sail in light. 7 words to summarize years of service and lifetimes of consequence, to distill the entire experience of submarine warfare down to its fundamental truth, that some men accept missions that offer no glory and considerable risk because the mission needs doing, and someone has to do it, and they choose to be that someone. What they understood, what they lived and breathed and carried in their bones, what we in our comfortable modern world have largely forgotten, is that true courage isn't the absence of fear. Courage isn't being unafraid. Courage isn't the Hollywood version where heroes charge into danger with grins on their faces and witty one-liners on their lips. Real courage is functioning despite fear. Real courage is doing the mission when every instinct screams to run, when your hands shake and your mouth goes dry, and your heart hammers so hard against your ribs that you think everyone around you must be able to hear it. Real courage is standing the watch when the U-boat is still out there somewhere in the darkness, and you absolutely know, that it could surface and fire at any moment, and there's nothing you can do except keep listening and keep tracking and keep hoping that your training and your equipment and your luck will be enough. The submarine hunters of World War II weren't superhuman. They didn't possess extraordinary physical abilities or special genetic advantages or psychological profiles that marked them as natural warriors. They were farmers from Iowa and mechanics from Detroit and college students from Boston. They were boys who became men not gradually, through the normal process of aging and experience, but suddenly, violently, in the span of a sonar ping that detected a U-boat or a torpedo that missed by 20 yards, or a depth charge attack that ended with wreckage surfacing and the knowledge that 40 men just died and you're the one who killed them. They were terrified every day they were at sea. They questioned whether they would survive, whether the mission was worth the cost, whether they had the strength to keep going when exhaustion made thinking difficult and fear made sleep impossible. They struggled with doubt and homesickness and the grinding monotony of convoy duty, punctuated by moments of terror so intense that time seemed to stop. But they stayed. This is the thing that matters most, the core truth that defines their legacy and speaks across the decades to every generation that follows. They stayed on station when the U-boat was still out there, when contact had been lost and the captain ordered them to continue searching, to keep running patterns over the last known position hour after hour until either they regained contact or were ordered to rejoin the convoy. They stayed when the convoy needed protection, when merchant ships were depending on them to keep the sea lanes clear, when failure meant not just their own deaths, but the deaths of civilian sailors who had no defense against submarines except the destroyer escorts screening their flanks. They stayed when going home was an option, when their enlistments were up, or their ships needed major repairs, or they'd earned rotation back to training duty stateside. They could have requested transfers, could have found medical reasons to be declared unfit for sea duty, could have accepted the honorable alternatives that would have taken them away from the Atlantic and the wolf packs and the constant threat of death in cold water. But they stayed because the mission wasn't finished and other men were staying. And there's a covenant among warriors that you don't abandon your brothers, that you don't leave while the fight continues, that if death comes, it finds you at your post, doing your duty. They stayed when going home was not just an option, but a temptation so powerful that resisting it required daily recommitment to the choice they'd made. daily renewal of the promise they'd given when they volunteered for destroyer escort duty. They stayed when dying was not a remote possibility, but a probability that grew with every patrol, with every convoy, with every encounter with the enemy that left them still alive, but knowing that the odds were catching up, and eventually the statistics would claim them the way statistics claimed so many others. The eternal question that hangs over all of this, the question that historians and psychologists and philosophers have struggled to answer with any degree of satisfaction, is simply, why? Why did they stay? Why did they continue accepting missions that offered minimal recognition and maximum danger? Why did they keep going to sea when they'd already done enough, when they'd earned the right to stop, when no one would have blamed them for accepting safer assignments? The complex answer involves duty and honor and patriotism and all the grand abstractions that nations invoke when they ask their young men to go into harm's way. It involves the very real belief that they were fighting for a cause worth dying for, that defeating fascism justified the sacrifices required, that freedom and democracy and the American way of life were valuable enough to merit the price in blood and trauma and shattered lives. But there's a simpler answer too, one that cuts through all the political and philosophical complexity and reaches the bedrock truth of why warriors fight. One veteran interviewed for an oral history project when he was 90 years old, and death was close enough that he could speak with the freedom of someone who has nothing left to lose, provided this answer when asked why he kept volunteering for patrols when he could have rotated stateside. The interviewer expected a speech about patriotism or duty or the importance of the mission. Instead, the old man, whose hand still trembled slightly when loud noises startled him despite 7 decades of distance from the war, answered with a simplicity that rendered further explanation unnecessary. "Because the guy next to me was staying," he said, his voice steady despite his age, "and I wasn't going to let him face it alone." That's the truth of submarine warfare that transcends tactics and technology and strategic objectives. That's the truth of all war, of all combat, of all situations where human beings face death together and make choices about courage and cowardice, about staying and running, about honor and survival. It's not about the enemy you're fighting. The German submariners were dangerous and skilled and committed to their own cause, with the same intensity that Allied sailors brought to their mission, but they were ultimately just men doing their jobs in a war they didn't start. The real story is never about the enemy. The real story is always about the brother standing next to you, the man who shares your fear and your exhaustion and your determination to see the mission through. The real story is about the sonar man who's been at his station for 16 hours straight because the replacement is sick and someone needs to keep listening. It's about the captain who hasn't slept in 3 days because the convoy is in dangerous waters and he can't delegate the responsibility of command. It's about the depth charge crew that works in freezing rain with hands so cold they can barely grip the equipment, because if they don't do their job perfectly, everyone dies. The story is about looking at the man beside you and knowing that he's as scared as you are, as tired as you are, as tempted to give up as you are, and knowing that he's staying anyway, and knowing that if he's staying, then you're staying too, because that's what brothers do. They stay, they endure. They fight not because they're unafraid, but because they refuse to abandon each other. Because the bond between warriors who face death together is stronger than the fear of dying. Because some things matter more than survival, and brotherhood is one of them. Return to the opening image, to the place where this story began and where all stories about the ocean must eventually end. The Atlantic stretches to the horizon under a sky that changes from dawn to dawn again, indifferent to human drama, unmoved by the struggles that play out on its surface and in its depths. The ocean is still watching, still patient, still holding its secrets in places so deep that sunlight has never penetrated and never will. still hiding its dead in the darkness, where pressure crushes everything human into something unrecognizable, where steel and flesh and dreams become part of the eternal sediment. The wrecks are down there still, destroyer escorts and U-boats resting on the bottom in their final positions, locked in combat that will never end because the ocean preserves what it takes. The bodies are gone, consumed by time and salt water and the creatures that live in the deep places, but the ships remain as monuments to men who fought and died far from home in a war that most people today know only from history books and fading photographs. Stephen E. Ambrose spent his career studying ordinary men who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances, who discovered capabilities they didn't know they possessed, and paid prices they couldn't have imagined when they first volunteered. His core message, articulated most powerfully in Band of Brothers but present throughout all his work, is that these men became extraordinary, not through superhuman ability, but through commitment to each other, under impossible circumstances. They weren't born heroes. They became heroes through the accumulation of small choices made under pressure, through the daily decision to keep going when stopping would have been easier, through the refusal to abandon their brothers, even when abandonment might have saved their own lives. The submarine hunters embodied this truth in the most isolated, terrifying theater of the war. They fought in darkness so complete that they couldn't see their own hands in front of their faces. They fought in silence so profound that a dropped wrench could give away their position and get everyone killed. They fought invisible enemies in an environment designed to kill humans, where one mistake meant death for the entire crew, and there were no individual failures, only collective success or collective annihilation. And through all of this, they maintained their humanity, their connection to each other, their commitment to the mission and the men depending on them. They became extraordinary by staying ordinary, by refusing to let the circumstances turn them into something less than human, by holding on to their compassion and their honor even when war made both seem like luxuries they couldn't afford. Reflect on the permanent cost, on the price that cannot be calculated in dollars or ships or strategic advantage. These men volunteered to descend into darkness. They raised their hands and took the oath knowing that submarine warfare was the most dangerous duty in the Navy, that life expectancy for destroyer escort crews was measured in months, not years, that the Atlantic was a graveyard and they were sailing into it with their eyes open. They volunteered to hunt an invisible enemy that could kill them without warning, that could fire torpedoes from positions they couldn't detect with equipment they couldn't counter. They knew they might never surface from their final dive, knew that their families might receive telegrams saying only that their ship was lost with all hands in the North Atlantic and no further details were available because war doesn't provide details. War just takes and takes and takes until there's nothing left but grief and unanswered questions. And they did it anyway. They made the choice not once but every single day. Every time they went to their stations, every time they stood the watch, every time they heard a sonar contact and knew that the next few minutes would determine whether they lived or died. They chose duty over safety. They chose mission over survival. They chose brotherhood over self-preservation. And having made those choices, they lived with the consequences for the rest of their lives. The nightmares and the phantom sounds and the inability to exist comfortably in silence. The knowledge of what they'd done and what had been done to them. The memories that wouldn't fade, no matter how much time passed or how much distance they put between themselves and the war. William Manchester, who fought in the Pacific and spent 40 years trying to understand his own experiences and the experiences of his fellow Marines, wrote a truth so haunting that it resonates across all wars and all generations of warriors. In Goodbye, Darkness, his memoir of returning to the battlefields where he nearly died, he wrote that the deaths of young men in war are an abomination, not a tragedy, not a necessity, an abomination, a violation of everything that should be sacred about human life and human potential. These were boys who should have grown old, who should have married and had children and built careers and contributed to their communities in peacetime. They should have become teachers and doctors and farmers and factory workers. They should have lived full lives and died in their beds, surrounded by grandchildren. Instead, they died young in the cold Atlantic or the burning Pacific or the blood-soaked fields of Europe, and their deaths diminished everyone who survived them. But Manchester also wrote that their courage is a gift, not a consolation, not a silver lining, a gift, something precious handed down from those who died to those who lived, from those who served to those who didn't, from one generation to the next. And we dishonor them not by mourning, not by feeling sadness at their loss, but by forgetting, by allowing their sacrifices to fade into historical footnotes, by treating their service as something that happened long ago to people who have nothing to do with us, by failing to remember not just that they died, but how they lived, what they believed, what they gave up, so that others could have futures they would never see. Present the moral inheritance that these submarine hunters left to every generation that followed. The lesson encoded in their service that transcends the specific circumstances of their war. The submarine hunters teach us that heroism doesn't require visibility. The greatest acts of courage often happen where no one is watching, in the silent spaces where duty and fear collide, and men must choose between what's easy and what's right, with no witnesses except their own consciences and the brothers standing beside them. They teach us that honor isn't about recognition or reward or public acknowledgement. Honor is about keeping faith with your commitments even when breaking them would be easier and no one would know. Honor is about doing your job to the absolute best of your ability, even when success means nothing happens and failure means headlines and blame. Honor is about staying on station when you could leave, about hunting one more U-boat when you've already done enough, about standing the watch through one more night when you're so tired that staying awake requires physical effort and conscious will. They teach us that brotherhood is forged not in easy times, but in hard ones, not when everything is going well, but when everything is falling apart, not through shared pleasure, but through shared suffering. The bonds they formed with each other under the worst circumstances humans can face proved stronger than the fear of death, proved capable of sustaining them through experiences that should have broken them, proved durable enough to last lifetimes and transcend the specific war that created them. Close with the image of a modern destroyer, sleek and powerful and equipped with technology, those World War II sailors would have considered science fiction, passing over the grave of a U-boat that went down in 1943 and has rested on the bottom ever since. The modern ship's sonar likely detected the wreck during a routine transit, logged it as a contact of interest, noted the position for navigation purposes, and moved on. The crew probably doesn't know what they passed over, doesn't know that beneath them lie the remains of 42 German sailors who died doing their duty as they understood it. And somewhere nearby, possibly within visual range, if the water were clear enough to see that deep, lies the wreck of the destroyer escort that sank them before being torpedoed itself 3 weeks later. Two enemies, still locked in their eternal duel beneath the waves, where the pressure is so great that human bodies cannot exist, and the darkness is so complete that light itself surrenders. Above them, free ships sail unmolested, carrying cargo and passengers across an ocean that's safe now, not because the threats disappeared, but because men like those submarine hunters made them disappear through blood and sacrifice and the willingness to hunt in darkness. The shipping lanes are clear. The convoys arrive safely. The strategic materials flow uninterrupted from continent to continent. And almost no one remembers the men who made this possible, who fought and died in anonymity so that others could live in peace. Final truth. The culmination of everything this story has tried to convey, the message that must survive when all the tactical details and historical specifics have faded from memory. The ocean was watching, and what it saw was men choosing honor over safety, choosing brotherhood over survival, choosing mission over self. The same choice warriors have made since the beginning of time, in every war, on every battlefield, even one as silent and dark as the depths of the Atlantic. The choice to stand when you could run. The choice to fight when you could hide. The choice to stay when you could leave. The choice to put others before yourself, to value duty above comfort, to accept sacrifice as the price of service. Some warriors fight in sunlight, with the world watching, with cameras recording their heroism, and journalists writing their stories, and historians preserving their legacy. Others fight in darkness, with only their conscience as witness, with no one to record their courage except the ocean itself and the brothers who stood beside them. The submarine hunters chose the darkness. They descended into the abyss where fear lived, and enemies hunted, and death waited in the cold water. And in choosing darkness, they brought light to those who followed. They made the sea lanes safe. They protected the convoys. They ensured that the strategic materials reached their destinations and the war could be won. They paid the price in trauma and loss, and years of silent suffering so that others could sail in safety and live in peace. Their watch is over, but the watch continues. It always continues, because there will always be darkness, and there will always be men willing to descend into it, willing to hunt invisible enemies, willing to stand between the innocent and those who would harm them. The watch continues, and the ocean is still watching.